The morning sun cast long shadows across the veteran's hospital corridor as James Mitchell pushed his wheelchair down the familiar hallway. At 73 years old, his weathered hands gripped the wheels with practiced ease, navigating between rushing nurses and visiting families. The faded olive-green jacket he wore bore no insignia, no medals, nothing to suggest the extraordinary man beneath the ordinary appearance. James had been coming to this hospital for routine checkups for the past 5 years. The staff knew him as a quiet, polite veteran who never complained about waiting times or asked for special treatment. He would sit patiently in the waiting room, sometimes for hours, watching younger veterans receive care while he waited his turn. Nobody knew that 50 years ago, this same man had single-handedly saved 37 soldiers during one of the bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War. The Battle of Fire Base Charlie had been a nightmare that lasted 3 days in 1971. James was just 23 then, a sergeant in the 1st Infantry Division. When enemy forces surrounded their position and cut off all supply lines, most soldiers thought they would never see home again. The radio crackled with desperate calls for help, but reinforcements were days away. That's when James Mitchell did something that would haunt him for decades. Under heavy fire, he crawled through mud and shrapnel to reach a disabled tank. The crew was trapped inside, wounded and unable to escape. James forced open the hatch, pulling out 3 injured soldiers while bullets whistled overhead, but he wasn't done. For the next 18 hours, he made trip after trip into enemy territory, carrying wounded men to safety one by one. When ammunition ran low, James volunteered to make the dangerous journey to the ammunition depot 2 miles away. The route was completely exposed, with enemy snipers covering every inch. He loaded his backpack with as much ammunition as he could carry and began the treacherous trek back. Halfway there, he encountered a group of enemy soldiers. In the firefight that followed, James was shot twice, but managed to eliminate the threat and continue his mission. By the time reinforcements arrived, James had saved 37 lives and prevented the complete destruction of Fire Base Charlie. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, immediately recommended him for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork was filed, witnesses gave their statements, and everyone expected James to receive the nation's highest military decoration. But something went wrong in the bureaucratic maze of military administration. The recommendation sat on someone's desk for months. Then it was transferred to another office, where it sat for more months. Key witnesses were transferred to different units or discharged from service. The original paperwork was misfiled, and eventually, the recommendation disappeared entirely into the vast Pentagon filing system. James never spoke about what happened at Fire Base Charlie. When he returned home, he found that most people wanted to forget about the war entirely. He got a job at a local factory, married his high school sweetheart Sarah, and raised 3 children. The memories of that terrible battle stayed locked inside him, surfacing only in nightmares that would wake him in cold sweats. Years passed, and James watched as other veterans received recognition for their service. He felt no bitterness, only a quiet sadness that his fallen comrades from Fire Base Charlie had been forgotten along with his own actions. He never contacted anyone about his missing recommendation. He believed that some things were more important than medals and recognition. Now, decades later, James spent his days in the same routine. Morning coffee at the kitchen table where Sarah used to sit before cancer took her 2 years ago. A slow walk to the mailbox. Afternoons reading at the library or visiting the hospital for his various medical appointments. His children lived in different states, busy with their own families and careers. They called on holidays and sent birthday cards. But they knew little about their father's war experiences. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez had been James's physician for 3 years. She noticed how he never complained about pain, even when his medical chart suggested he should be in agony. Old shrapnel wounds caused constant discomfort, and his left leg had never properly healed from a bullet wound. but James would simply nod and say he was doing fine when she asked about his pain levels. Today was different. As Dr. Rodriguez reviewed James's file, she noticed something she had overlooked before. In his military medical records, there was a notation about a Medal of Honor recommendation that had been processed but never completed. Her curiosity was piqued, but when she asked James about it, he simply shrugged and changed the subject. That evening, Dr. Rodriguez couldn't stop thinking about the notation. She had treated many veterans over the years, and she knew how important recognition was for their sense of dignity and closure. She decided to do some research on her own time. What she discovered in the military archives would change everything. The files were dusty and disorganized, but after several hours of searching, Dr. Rodriguez found what she was looking for. The original Medal of Honor recommendation for Sergeant James Mitchell was still there, buried in a box of unprocessed paperwork from 1971. The detailed accounts from witnesses painted a picture of heroism that took her breath away. According to the testimonies, James had displayed courage that went beyond anything in the military textbooks. Soldiers described how he had risked his life repeatedly, never hesitating to help others even when his own survival was in doubt. One witness wrote that James Mitchell embodied everything the Medal of Honor was meant to represent: conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Dr. Rodriguez realized that a terrible injustice had been done. This man, who now sat quietly in her waiting room like any other patient, was a hero who had been overlooked by the very system he had served with such distinction. She knew she had to act, but she wasn't sure how to proceed. The next morning, she made a phone call that would set in motion a chain of events that would finally give James Mitchell the recognition he had earned 50 years ago. She contacted the office of Congressman Michael Thompson, who had a reputation for helping veterans navigate military bureaucracy. When Congressman Thompson's assistant first heard the story, she was skeptical. 50-year-old paperwork, missing recommendations, and forgotten heroes sounded like the plot of a movie rather than reality. But when Dr. Rodriguez faxed over copies of the documents she had found, the assistant immediately understood the significance of what she was looking at. Within hours, the story had reached Congressman Thompson himself. As a former Marine, he knew the value of the Medal of Honor and understood how devastating it must be for a deserving veteran to be forgotten. He personally called Dr. Rodriguez and promised that his office would investigate the matter thoroughly. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern of administrative failures that had affected dozens of Medal of Honor recommendations during the chaotic final years of the Vietnam War. James Mitchell's case was not unique, but it was perhaps the most egregious example of how bureaucratic incompetence had denied heroes their rightful recognition. Meanwhile, James continued his daily routine, unaware that his life was about to change dramatically. He still came to the hospital for his appointments, still sat quietly in the waiting room, still treated everyone with the same courteous dignity that had defined his character for 7 decades. Dr. Rodriguez found it increasingly difficult to maintain her professional composure when she saw James. She wanted to tell him what she had discovered, but Congressman Thompson had asked her to wait until the investigation was complete. The anticipation was killing her, but she knew that James deserved to have his recognition handled properly this time. 3 weeks after Dr. Rodriguez had made her initial phone call, Congressman Thompson received a call that would accelerate everything. The call came from the Pentagon, from someone who had been following the investigation with great interest, someone who understood better than anyone the importance of correcting this long-overdue injustice. General William "Bull" Harrison was not a man easily impressed. As a 4-star general with 42 years of military service, he had seen courage in every form imaginable. He had commanded troops in 3 different wars and had personally recommended dozens of soldiers for various decorations. But when he read the file about James Mitchell while reviewing cases for the Pentagon's Military Decorations Review Board, something stirred in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. The general was known throughout the military for his attention to detail and his unwavering commitment to ensuring that deserving soldiers received proper recognition. He had made it his personal mission during his final years of service to review cases where administrative errors might have denied heroes their rightful honors. Most cases involved minor decorations or clerical mistakes that could be easily corrected. But James Mitchell's case was different. General Harrison spread the documents across his mahogany desk in his Pentagon office. The testimonies from Firebase Charlie painted a picture of heroism that reminded him why he had dedicated his life to military service. As he read each witness statement, his respect for Sergeant Mitchell grew. This wasn't just about bravery in combat. This was about a young soldier who had placed the lives of his comrades above his own survival repeatedly over 3 days of intense fighting. What disturbed the general even more than the original oversight was the fact that James Mitchell had never pursued the matter himself. In Harrison's experience, soldiers who had been wrongly denied recognition typically fought the system for years to get justice. But according to the records, Mitchell had never filed a single inquiry or appeal. He had simply returned to civilian life and carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. General Harrison picked up his secure phone and called the office of the Army's Chief of Staff. Within an hour, he was in a meeting with the highest-ranking officials in the Army, presenting James Mitchell's case. The room fell silent as he read excerpts from the witness testimonies. These were men who had seen everything in their long military careers, but they were moved by the story of a forgotten hero who had asked for nothing in return. The decision was unanimous and immediate. Not only would James Mitchell's Medal of Honor recommendation be reviewed and approved, but the ceremony would be conducted with all the dignity and honor befitting such a momentous occasion. General Harrison volunteered to personally oversee every detail of the process, but first they had to inform James himself. General Harrison insisted that this notification be handled with the utmost care. This was a man who had waited 50 years for recognition he never expected to receive. The general wanted to make sure that James understood the magnitude of what was happening and that he was given the respect he deserved throughout the entire process. General Harrison made an unprecedented decision. Instead of sending a subordinate or making a phone call, he would personally travel to James's hometown to deliver the news. He cleared his schedule for the following week and arranged for a small team to accompany him. This would not be a media spectacle or a publicity stunt. This would be a quiet, dignified notification that honored both the recipient and the medal itself. Meanwhile, Dr. Rodriguez had been sworn to secrecy about the ongoing investigation. The stress of keeping such momentous news to herself was almost unbearable. Every time she saw James in the hospital, she had to fight the urge to tell him that his life was about to change forever. She noticed that James seemed more tired lately, and she worried that his health might be declining just as his greatest moment was approaching. James himself had no idea that his name was being discussed in the highest levels of military command. He continued his quiet routine, tending to his small garden behind the modest house where he and Sarah had raised their family. The tomatoes were coming in well this year, and he planned to share them with his neighbors as he always did. These simple acts of kindness were how James had always expressed himself, never knowing that they reflected the same generous spirit that had saved so many lives at Firebase Charlie. On a Tuesday morning in late September, James was watering his tomato plants when he noticed a black sedan pulling into his driveway. Government plates. His first thought was that there might be some problem with his veterans' benefits or medical coverage. He set down the hose and walked slowly toward the front door, his old injuries making him move carefully across the uneven ground. When he opened the door, James found himself face to face with a man in an immaculate military uniform, adorned with ribbons and stars that indicated the highest levels of command. General Harrison stood at attention on the front porch, flanked by two aides who also maintained perfect military bearing. The general's expression was serious but kind, and James immediately sensed that this was no routine visit. "Sergeant Mitchell," General Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command, but softened with genuine respect. "I am General William Harrison, United States Army. May I come in? I have something very important to discuss with you." James felt his heart skip a beat. In all his years as a civilian, no active-duty general had ever visited his home. He invited them in, offering coffee and apologizing for the modest surroundings. General Harrison waved off the apologies and asked if James would prefer to sit down for what he had to say. The general opened a leather briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "Sergeant Mitchell," he began, "I'm here because of something that happened at Firebase Charlie in 1971. Something that should have been addressed 50 years ago." James felt the color drain from his face. He had never spoken to anyone outside the military about Firebase Charlie, and he had assumed that those events had been forgotten by history. His hands trembled slightly as memories of that terrible battle came flooding back. General Harrison noticed James's discomfort and spoke gently. "Sir, what you did during those 3 days represents the finest traditions of military service. You saved 37 lives through repeated acts of courage that went far beyond any reasonable expectation of duty. Your commanding officer recommended you for the Medal of Honor, and that recommendation was properly filed and documented." The general paused, allowing James to process this information. "However, due to administrative failures that were inexcusable then and are inexcusable now, your recommendation was lost in the system. You never received the recognition you earned, and for that, the United States Army owes you an apology." James sat in stunned silence. After 50 years, he had learned to live with the assumption that his actions at Firebase Charlie had been forgotten or deemed unworthy of recognition. He had made peace with that reality, or so he thought. Now, hearing these words from one of the Army's highest-ranking officers, emotions he had suppressed for decades began to surface. "Sir," James said quietly, "I never did what I did for medals or recognition. Those men were my brothers, and you don't leave your brothers behind." General Harrison smiled for the first time since arriving. "That attitude, Sergeant Mitchell, is exactly why you deserve the Medal of Honor. The medal isn't about seeking recognition. It's about recognizing exceptional character and courage, regardless of whether the recipient seeks it." The general then delivered the news that would change James's life forever. "The Pentagon has reviewed your case, and the Army Chief of Staff has personally approved your Medal of Honor recommendation. If you accept, you will be awarded the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House with full military honors." James couldn't speak. The enormity of what he was hearing was too much to process. The Medal of Honor was the highest decoration his country could bestow, and he was being told that he would receive it 50 years after he had earned it. General Harrison continued, "The ceremony will be conducted with the dignity and respect that both you and the medal deserve. Your family will be invited, and we will ensure that the memory of your fallen comrades from Firebase Charlie is honored as well." Through tears that he couldn't stop, James managed to ask, "What about the men who didn't make it home? Will they be remembered too?" "Absolutely," General Harrison replied. "Their sacrifice and your actions that saved so many others will be part of the official record. Their names will be spoken with the respect they deserve." As the general and his aides prepared to leave, James walked them to the door with unsteady steps. The weight of 50 years seemed to be lifting from his shoulders, but it was being replaced by a different kind of overwhelming emotion. For the first time since Sarah's death, James felt like his life had a purpose beyond simply enduring each day. General Harrison shook James's hand with both of his own. Sergeant Mitchell, it has been an honor to meet you. You represent the best of what America has to offer, and I'm proud to have played a small part in correcting this injustice. After the car disappeared down the street, James sat in his kitchen chair and wept. He thought about Sarah, who had always believed her husband was a hero, even though she never knew the details of what he had done. He thought about his comrades from Firebase Charlie, especially the ones who had died before they could see their families again. And for the first time in 50 years, he allowed himself to feel proud of what he had accomplished during those terrible 3 days in Vietnam. The White House Rose Garden had hosted many ceremonies over the decades, but few carried the emotional weight of this October morning. James Mitchell sat in his wheelchair near the podium, wearing the dress uniform that had been specially tailored for this occasion. At 73, he looked every inch the soldier he had been 50 years ago, his back straight despite the pain from old injuries, his eyes clear and focused. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of activity that James could never have imagined. General Harrison had been true to his word, ensuring that every detail of the ceremony honored both the recipient and the significance of the medal. James's 3 children had flown in from across the country, bringing grandchildren he rarely saw. His younger brother Tom, now 71 himself, had driven up from Florida. Even some of his old factory co-workers had made the trip to Washington. But the most meaningful guests were the ones James hadn't expected. Through military records and veteran organizations, the Army had located 12 survivors from Firebase Charlie. These men, now in their 70s, had traveled from all over America to witness their sergeant receive the recognition he had earned by saving their lives. Some were in wheelchairs, others walked with canes, but all carried themselves with the dignity of men who had faced hell and lived to tell about it. Dr. Rodriguez sat in the front row, tears already flowing freely. She couldn't help but think about all those quiet appointments when she had treated James like just another elderly patient. The man who had never complained about pain, who had always thanked the nurses for their service, who had sat patiently in waiting rooms without ever demanding special treatment, was about to receive the nation's highest honor for valor. President Sarah Chen stepped to the podium, her expression reflecting the gravity of the moment. She had read James's complete military file, including the witness testimonies from Firebase Charlie, and she understood that this ceremony was about more than correcting an administrative error. This was about honoring the values that defined America at its best. Ladies and gentlemen, the president began, we gathered today to right a wrong that has persisted for 50 years, but more than that, we gather to celebrate the extraordinary courage and selflessness of Sergeant James Mitchell, whose actions during the Battle of Firebase Charlie exemplify the very best of American military service. The president recounted the events of those 3 days in 1971, reading from the witness statements that painted a picture of heroism that seemed almost impossible to believe. As she described James crawling through enemy fire to save wounded soldiers, making multiple trips into danger to evacuate the injured, and risking his life to secure ammunition for his surrounded unit, even the battle-hardened veterans in the audience were moved to tears. James listened to the account of his own actions with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Every name the president mentioned brought back memories of young faces that had haunted his dreams for decades. Tommy Rodriguez, 19 years old, who had taken shrapnel in his chest. Billy Thompson, barely 20, who had lost his leg but kept fighting. Marcus Williams, 22, who had died in James's arms despite all efforts to save him. When the president came to the part about the ammunition run that had saved Firebase Charlie from being overrun, James closed his eyes and remembered that desperate journey. The weight of the ammunition on his back, the crack of sniper bullets overhead, the burning sensation when enemy fire had found his left leg. But mostly he remembered the faces of the men he was fighting to save, the knowledge that their survival depended on his success. The Medal of Honor President Chen continued, is awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Sergeant Mitchell's actions on those 3 days in October 1971 represent the highest ideals of military service. He placed the lives of his fellow soldiers above his own safety, repeatedly and without hesitation. General Harrison stepped forward, carrying a blue ribbon from which hung the distinctive star-shaped medal. As he approached James, the general thought about all the ceremonies he had attended over the years, all the brave soldiers he had seen honored. But this moment felt different. This was a man who had waited 50 years for recognition he never expected to receive, who had lived his entire adult life carrying the memory of his heroism in private. The president's aide wheeled James closer to the podium. Despite his age and infirmity, James insisted on standing for the actual presentation of the medal. With tremendous effort and obvious pain, he rose from his wheelchair and stood at attention. The assembled crowd of family, friends, and fellow veterans rose with him in spontaneous respect. "Sergeant James Mitchell," President Chen said formally, "for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty while serving with the 1st Infantry Division during combat operations against enemy forces in the Republic of Vietnam, the President of the United States takes pleasure in presenting the Medal of Honor." As General Harrison placed the medal around James's neck, the elderly veteran's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks as he felt the weight of the medal against his chest. It wasn't the physical weight that moved him. It was the weight of 50 years of carrying his memories alone, of wondering if his sacrifice had mattered, of missing his fallen comrades who would never receive their own recognition. The crowd erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. James's children wept openly as they finally understood the magnitude of what their father had done as a young man. His grandchildren, ranging in age from 8 to 16, looked at their grandfather with newfound awe and respect. But the most emotional moment came when the 12 survivors from Firebase Charlie slowly made their way to the front of the ceremony. These men, saved by James's actions 50 years ago, had waited half a century to properly thank the sergeant who had given them the chance to return home to their families. Private First Class Mike Stevens, now 72 and walking with a cane, was the first to reach James. "Sarge," he said, his voice breaking, "I've wanted to say this for 50 years. Thank you for bringing me home to my wife and kids. Thank you for giving me a lifetime I wouldn't have had." One by one, the survivors embraced their former sergeant. Some spoke, others simply held him close, but all carried the same message: gratitude for a second chance at life that James Mitchell had given them at Firebase Charlie. The ceremony concluded with a 21-gun salute and the playing of taps. As the haunting melody filled the rose garden, James thought about all his comrades who hadn't made it home, whose families had received folded flags instead of reunion embraces. The medal he wore represented not just his own courage, but the sacrifice of every soldier who had served alongside him. After the formal ceremony, a reception was held in the White House State Dining Room. James found himself surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand and hear his story. But he was most comfortable talking with the other veterans, sharing memories of Firebase Charlie and catching up on the lives they had all lived since returning home. Dr. Rodriguez approached James during a quiet moment in the reception. "How does it feel?" she asked simply. James considered the question carefully. "It feels like closure," he said finally. "Not just for me, but for all the men who served at Firebase Charlie. Their sacrifice has been honored, and that means everything." General Harrison made a point of spending time with James before leaving. "Sergeant," he said, "I want you to know that your story has already inspired changes in how we handle military decorations. We've implemented new systems to ensure that no deserving soldier is ever forgotten again. James smiled. That's good to hear, General. No one should have to wait 50 years for recognition. The day had been exhausting for James, both physically and emotionally. As his family prepared to take him back to his hotel, he took one last look around the White House. Tomorrow he would return to his quiet life in his small town, but he would never again be just another forgotten veteran. The story of James Mitchell's Medal of Honor ceremony made headlines across the country. But more importantly, it sparked a nationwide effort to review cases of other veterans who might have been overlooked. The Pentagon established the Mitchell Review Board, dedicated to investigating potential administrative failures that might have denied deserving soldiers their proper recognition. James lived for 3 more years after receiving his Medal of Honor. Those years were filled with speaking engagements at schools and veteran organizations, where he shared not just the story of Firebase Charlie, but the importance of service, sacrifice, and never forgetting those who served. He used his newfound platform to advocate for better care for aging veterans and to ensure that the stories of forgotten heroes were preserved for future generations. When James Mitchell passed away peacefully in his sleep at age 76, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched. General Harrison delivered the eulogy, describing James as a man who had served his country with distinction, both in war and in peace. The Medal of Honor was buried with him, finally resting with the hero who had earned it through extraordinary courage and carried it with quiet dignity. At the Veterans Hospital, where James had spent so many quiet hours in waiting rooms, Dr. Rodriguez established the James Mitchell Memorial Fund to support overlooked veterans seeking recognition for their service. A plaque in the hospital lobby reads, "In honor of Sergeant James Mitchell, Medal of Honor recipient, who reminds us that true heroism often goes unrecognized, but never unrewarded by those who matter most." The story of James Mitchell became a legend in military circles, taught at service academies as an example of how true heroism is defined not by seeking recognition, but by selfless service to others. Firebase Charlie, once a forgotten battlefield, was designated as a memorial site where the names of all who served there are engraved in stone. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to James Mitchell's legacy is the change he inspired in how America honors its heroes. Because of his story, thousands of other forgotten veterans have received the recognition they earned, and new systems ensure that administrative failures will never again deny brave soldiers their rightful place in history. James Mitchell waited 50 years for his Medal of Honor, but his patience and dignity in that wait taught the nation as much about character as his heroism at Firebase. Charlie taught about courage. In the end, he received not just a medal, but something far more valuable, the knowledge that his service mattered. His sacrifice was remembered, and his brothers in arms were honored alongside him.